Hello guys, welcome to the CSS crash course. In this video, we'll learn about CSS Grid layout. My name is Kafui and welcome to my channel mods.dev. Please subscribe, like and hit the bell icon to get notified whenever I release a content on the channel. With that said, let's get started. CSS Grid is a layout system that allows you to create complex web layouts by defining rows and columns to arrange elements on a web page. So in this video, we'll look at how to create a grid container in CSS and look at some grid container properties. In my index.html file here, I have this outer div here with a class of grid container, and then I have nested these 10 divs in it with a class of grid item, and then grid item 1, grid item 2 through to grid item 10, and then the contents in the divs are 1, 2, 3 through to 10. So as you can see on the web page here. And then in my style.css file, I selected the grid item container and added some width and height to it. And then I added a border to it, so 5 pixels solid black. So let me put this side by side properly. So this is it. So this is the grid container with this border around it. And then I selected the grid items and then apply some background color to them. So now let's go ahead and look at how to create a grid container in CSS. So in order to create a grid container, I'll select my grid container div and then set the display property to what? Grid, and save. So upon so doing, this container here or this outer div here is now what? A grid container. Now, when working with CSS Grid, we have to define our own rows and our own columns. So in order to define your own column, we use the grid template column property. The grid template column property defines the columns in a grid container. So I'll just go ahead and write grid template columns and see that VS Code gives us auto completion. So this is where we define the number of column and then the size of the column. So let's say I want only 4 columns. I'll go ahead and define them, and then I want the size of each column to be let's say 100 pixels. So I'll say 100 pixels, 100 pixels, 100 pixels, and finally 100 pixels. So before I save, let me go over this. So whenever we are working with CSS Grid, we have to create our own columns and our own rows. So in order to create your own column, we use the grid template column property, and this is where we define the size of the column and then the number of columns. So by so doing, I have defined one column which I'm saying the size should be 100 pixels, another column which the size is 100 pixels, another column the size to be 100 pixels, and then finally the 4th column, and then the size should also be what? 100 pixels. When I do that and save, let's look at what you've gotten here. So now we have 1, 2, 3, 4 columns, and each of them is having the size of what? 100 pixels. When I go ahead and increase the size of the last one here, or the 4th column, to let's say 200 pixels, you see that the 4th column is now 200 pixels, and then the rest are what? 100 pixels. So this is how we can define our own columns when working with CSS Grid. Now I'll go ahead now and define our row. So by default, the CSS Grid algorithm creates our own rows for us based on the number of elements in what? The grid container. So let's say I remove one column to have 3 columns here. When I do that and save, now you see that we have 4 rows. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 rows. But we can create our own rows using the grid template rows property. So I'll just go ahead and write it, grid template rows, and by so doing, we can define the number of rows and then the size of our rows. So let's say I want to define 3 rows. So I can say the first row should be 100 pixels, the second row should be 100 pixels, and then the third row should also be what? 100 pixels. When I do that and save, now we have what? 1, 2, 3 rows. So this 4th element or this 4th grid item is auto placed on the 4th row, but we have defined only what? 4 rows. So I can go ahead and define, we have defined only 3 rows. So I can go ahead and define the next row, and I will say that row should be, let's say, 200 pixels, and then save. When I do that and save, now we have defined this row and it is what? 200 pixels. As you can see, it is even larger than the rest of the rows here. So I can say this second row should also be 200 pixels. And when I do that and save, now the second row here is 200 pixels, and then the last or the fourth row here is also 200 pixels, and then the rest of the rows are what, 100 pixels. So this is how we can define our own rows and columns in CSS. But whenever we are working with CSS Grid, we can use a fractional unit, which is a responsive unit. So I'll just go ahead and comment this out. So in order to define our columns, I'll save. So in order to define our columns, I'll use this. I'll just say grid template columns and say 1 FR, 2 FR, and then finally 1 FR to have 3 columns. So this is what we call what, the fractional unit or the FR unit. When I do that and save, so we have this fractional unit which creates these grid sizes for us. It is a responsive one, a layout. So now we have created these 3 columns, 1, 2, 3. The first one is 1 FR, the second one is 2 FR, and then the third one is also what, 1 FR. So this FR unit is a responsive unit, and we normally use it in creating what, grid layouts. So I can go ahead and define, let's say, only 3 rows. So I'll grid template rows and say 2 FR and 2 FR and then 2 FR. And when I do that and save, now we have 1, 2, 3 rows which are what, all 2 FRs. So this is how we can use the FR unit to create a responsive grid layout. And by default, this last element is auto placed on what, on the 4th row. And you see that because we didn't give it a size, it is giving this smaller size over here. So I can say it should be what, the 4th one should be, let's say, 3 FR. When I do that and save, you see that it is bigger than the rest of what, the rows. Now whenever we are working with grid layout, one thing we can also do is we can use the repeat function. So let me just save here. So I can say grid template columns and use the repeat function. So let's say I want 3 columns which are all, let's say, 2 FRs. So I can just do this and save. So this will create 3 columns and all of them will be what, 2 FR. Or I can create only 2 columns and all of them will be what, 2 FR. So we can use this repeat function in case we want this, we want all the sizes are the same, or if all the sizes of our rows or our columns are the same. So we can use the repeat function on the grid template rows property as well. And I can change this to, let's say, 200 pixels to as well, and we can see these rows are being, these columns are being created for us. So I can come here and say grid template columns, grid template rows, and then use the repeat function. And let's say I want 3 rows and all of them should be, let's say, 300 pixels. When I do that and save, we have this. No, let me just change this to 100 pixels. So we have these 3 rows, 1, 2, 3 rows created for us, and all of them are 100 pixels, or I can change this to what, 200 pixels. So that's it about the repeat function. Now let's move on to the next property. The next property we'll look at is called the gap property. The gap property sets the gap between rows and columns. So I'll just go ahead and save this and say grid template columns. I'll just say 2FR, 2FR, and finally 2FR to have 3 columns. When I do that and save, so we have these 3 columns being created for us. So I can use the gap property and say a gap of, let's say, 20 pixels. When I do that and save, it creates what, a gap or a space between the individual grid items. So these are grid items. So we have this column here with 20 pixels gap, and then the row over here also have what, 20 pixels gap. So let's say we want only a gap for only the columns, so we can say column gap. We can use the column gap property, and I'll just say 30 pixels for example. When I do that and save, we only have a gap for only what, the column. And likewise, I can define row gap for only row, and I'll say the row gap should be, let's say, 50 pixels. When I do that and save, so we have these 50 pixels for what, which is a gap for what, the rows. So when I comment this out so that we can see it properly, so you see a gap or a space of 50 pixels is being created for the rows. But when you want the same gaps should be created for both the rows and columns, we can use only what? The gap property. When I comment this out, you see that both the rows and columns are 20 pixels each. So let's move on. The next property we'll look at is the justify content property, which is used to align the whole grid inside the container. So I'll just go ahead, save this, and use justify content. And then you see that VS Code gives us some of the values that we can assign to it. When I say center and save, it aligns the whole grid content in the what? Center of the grid container. I can use a space between and save, or let me say start or flex start, no, start. And so there are a lot of values that we can work with. So because I don't have much space in my grid container, we don't see some of the values or the results over here. But the justify content property is used to align the whole grid inside the container. So some values are space between, space around, start, end, and then center. So as we look at earlier. So that's it about the justify content property. The next one we'll look at is the align content property, which is used to vertically align the whole grid inside the container. So we can use the align content property here, and some values you can provide as space between, start, center, and space around. So this will align the items what? Vertically in the grid container. So since we have more space vertically, or the height, we have more height in the container, we see that this one is being applied, and you see that all the grid items are aligned in the center of what? The container here. I can specify space between. When I do that and save, it creates a space vertically between the grid items. We have space around. When I do that and save, you see that it creates space around it. You have space evenly, and then it creates space evenly around what? The container. So that's it about the align content property. I'll just set it to center. Now let me just comment this out, which is the justify content property, and then I'll just go ahead and then increase the width here to, let's say 700 pixels, so that we have more space. Let me zoom out a bit for you to see. Let me just zoom out for you to see. Then I'll just change this to let's say 100 pixels each. So I'll say 100 pixels, and then 100 pixels, and then finally 100 pixels. When I do that and save, now you see that the items are now aligned at the center horizontally. So that's it. So I can set the value to space between, and it creates a space between them horizontally. I can set the value to space around. It creates a space around them. Space evenly. It creates a space evenly around the entire grid items in the grid container. Now, one thing I want us to look at is how we can visualize a grid container in our browser dev tools. So just right click on your web page and then click on inspect to take you to your dev tools. I'm zoom in. So by so doing, let me zoom out a bit. I don't know if you can see this properly, but just follow the instructions. So when I go to this side, you see that we see this grid indication here, this grid indication on the grid container div here. So just click on it to activate it. So and click on it to activate it. You see that it helps you visualize your grid in the web page here. So as you can see here, so you can see this. I don't know if you can see this. I'm zoomed in, but I don't know if you can see it properly. So you can click on this icon, and then you can play with what? Your grid container to align the grid items in what? The grid container. So we have the align content property here for you to work with. We have the align items, the justify items, and then the justify content property here as well. So that's how you can visualize a grid container in your browser dev tools. So that's all for this video. If you have any questions, put them in the comment section for discussion. Please subscribe, like, and hit the bell icon to get notified whenever I release a content on the channel. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one.